Tava Kathamritam Tapta Jivanam Kavivididitam Kalmashapaham Shravanamangalam Srimadatam Bhuviganantiye Bhurida Janaha. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our class on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. We've been discussing the entry from October 28th, 1882. We've been going through it slowly because it's a very packed entry with a lot of very lofty spiritual and philosophical teachings. So we're in the middle of it. Last time we focused on Kabir, his statement. Sri Ramakrishna said, Kabir used to say, the formless absolute is my father and God with form is my mother. And so a lot of the discussion last time was about Kabir's theology and specifically his conception of the ultimate reality, whether he was a kind of Vigyani in Sri Ramakrishna's sense or not. And I asked you guys to provide your suggestions and your ideas. And so I wanted to start by following up on that. I looked at your YouTube comments, and I'll read a couple of them that I thought were interesting and potentially helpful. One of them actually, let's see here. Okay, so Rajukar says, I think what Saint Kabir and other great saints like him have said is about their inner spiritual experiences, which they might have encountered during their day-to-day encounters with their personal and impersonal gods. It must have been spontaneous, instant. Their effort to express their inner bliss with the limited attributes of their mortal bodies which they were carrying, so the views can be slightly variable. Sometimes they must have felt like this and sometimes like that. They or anyone who experiences such a blissful feeling can express it out through the limited attributes of this mortal body-mind. So I think what he's suggesting is that Kabir was a Vigyani, and that he realized God in different forms and aspects and expressed those different realizations in the form of his different songs, his music, but that words are fundamentally limited in a way. So that's one suggestion. Another one is from the handle here is the Gita, and he plugged in the question to ChatGPT. And here's my, the answer is interesting. And my only concern with ChatGPT, well, I have multiple concerns, as I point out in my AI talk. But anyway, one of the concerns is hallucinations, because AI still seems quite prone to hallucinations. I've seen ChatGPT hallucinate many, many times. And so whoever gives, you can give ChatGPT answers, but I would like you to verify them. Check the original text and make sure. So this is what this person says after plugging in the ChatGPT. Here's the most commonly cited full verse, also found in Bijak Ramayani 77 and Kabir Granthavali 180, in its original Hindi couplet form. Nirakar pitahu sakar mata, sakar se manu nirakar jata. Roughly translated, I call the formless my father, and God with form is my mother. I die in the form and return to the formless. Okay. So can that person or anyone else verify that? Look up the textual reference here, Bijak Ramayani 77 and Kabir Granthavali 180. Because I've literally seen ChatGPT make up verses and cite the wrong scriptural verses, and so I just want some reassurance that this is actually there. I quickly tried to look it up and I couldn't find it, but I didn't look carefully enough. So if anyone can follow up on that, I'd really appreciate it. Look at the YouTube comment for details on that. I'm gonna read, let's see here. Okay. There's somebody who had a question, and I thought I would address it because it has to do with the discussion from last week about the nature of God. And I had mentioned in the last class, when I gave the diagram with the Nirguna, Saguna, Nirakara, Sakara, that of all the permutations, right, you can have Nirakara, Saguna, you can have Sakara, Saguna, you can have Nirguna, Nirakara. But I said that you can't really have Nirguna Sakara. Nirguna Sakara, which means God with form, but Nirguna, completely devoid of attributes. The main reasoning being that form itself is at least one attribute, which violates the Nirgunatva. And so Reena Rathod asked a question about this. Let's see. I'll skip the praise. Okay, then. I have a clarification to ask, though. When you say that it is not possible that God can be Nirgun Sakar, I wonder why you would say that. Because if I understand that by guna, we mean sattva, rajas, and tamas, and nirguna means transcending the gunas, then by very definition, the personal God is Nirguna Sakara. Right. And so here's the thing. I don't want people to get confused here about the meaning of guna. Guna means different things in different contexts. That's very important. And so if you look at chapter 14 of the Bhagavad Gita, for instance, and in chapter 17 and 18, the three gunas are talked about, sattva, rajas, and tamas. However, when I'm talking about nirguna and when Sri Ramakrishna is talking about God being nirguna, he doesn't mean just beyond the three gunas. He means guna in the sense of any kind of attribute whatsoever, including the omni attributes, including omniscience, omnipotence, perfectly loving, and so on and so forth, okay? And so guna has, I believe when Sri Ramakrishna is using the term guna to refer to God, he has in mind attributes in general. It's a much broader definition of guna than just the three gunas, okay? Okay, I think that's good. So thank you all for your suggestions and contributions. Keep thinking, and as I said, the person who gave the ChatGPT reference or anyone else, please cross-check ChatGPT because I don't trust it. All right. But I would love for it to be accurate because it gave this nice Hindi verse, and it sounds very much like what Sri Ramakrishna is saying. I would love for it to be true, so I don't want to be disappointed. So please look that up and let me know in the YouTube comments on this class. Okay, so now let's start with the next paragraph. Can you guys remind me, some of you came to the last class, did we read the paragraph, therefore I say that in the light of Vedantic reasoning, Brahman has no attributes. The real nature of Brahman cannot be described. But so long as your individuality is real, the world also is real, and equally real are the different forms of God and the feeling that God is a person. Does this ring any bells to anybody, or should I? Let me start with that then. Great. Okay, good. This is a very important paragraph. Huh? 150 of Nikhilanji's translation. October 28th, 1882. Okay, so now the context is he's been talking about the path of knowledge practiced by followers of classical Advaita Vedanta, classical non-dualism. Okay, and according to that's Shankara's school. According to Shankara's school, ultimate reality has no attributes. It's nirguna in the sense that we're talking about here, not just beyond the three gunas, but having absolutely no attributes. It's strictly attributeless, impersonal, non-dual, pure consciousness. Okay, and then he says, and here's where I think that it's worth thinking about what he means and I think possible interpretations. He says, but so long as your individuality is real, the world also is real, and equally real are the different forms of God and the feeling that God is a person. I think there are at least two different ways of understanding this sentence. One is from the standpoint of classical Advaita Vedanta, from Shankara's standpoint. Okay, because according to Shankara's school, these three things, Jiva, Jagat, and Ishvara. Jiva meaning individual souls, individuality. Jagat, this world of names and forms. And Ishvara, Saguna Brahman, the personal God. Stand and fall together. These three entities stand and fall together. According to classical Advaita Vedanta, there are two different levels of reality, we can say, or two different ontological standpoints, which are called the Vyavaharika standpoint, the transactional standpoint or the empirical standpoint, and the Paramatika standpoint, which is the ultimate standpoint. Okay. From the empirical standpoint, which is, according to Shankara, tantamount to the standpoint of ignorance. When am I in the standpoint of this empirical standpoint? So long as I've not realized my true nature as Brahman. So long as I remain ignorant of my true nature as non-dual pure consciousness, I remain at the transactional level. And insofar as I'm at this transactional level, this empirical level, I have to accept the reality of myself as an individual soul, a jiva. I have to accept the reality of this world of names and forms, and I have to accept the reality of the personal God. But the moment I gain knowledge of my nature as non-dual Brahman, what happens? I ascend to the ultimate standpoint, the Paramatika standpoint. Then what happens? All three of those drop away at one stroke. I'm like, Sri Ramakrishna will use the example of a salt doll going to measure the depth of the ocean. The moment it sets foot in the ocean, it melts, which means jiva dissolves. Second, what happens to the personal God? It turns out the personal God is also not real from the ultimate standpoint. Sri Ramakrishna says this explicitly in a different place in the gospel where he says, Jnanis, followers of Shankara, they say that Shakti itself is avastu. That's the exact Bengali word, abostu, which means it's not real. It's part of the dream. It's also a dream. And then, what's the third thing? The world of names and forms, also part of the dream, an illusion. It never existed. Okay? So that would be the classical Advaitic interpretation of this sentence. Now, let me ask you, do you think the classical Advaitic interpretation of this sentence is plausible? Why or why not? Anyone? Hard question. This is not the easiest question. And if you disagree with the classical Advaitic interpretation, what would be a better interpretation? Even harder. I just compounded the difficulties here. Anyone want to take a stab at this? Yes. Huh? I will read the sentence again. I've been told many, many times, especially in my talks, that I speak too quickly. And I was heavily scolded this time with my last talk that I gave here by like 3 different people. And yet I'm hopeless. Okay, I'm going to read the sentence again. I'll try to say it slowly. But so long as your individuality is real, the world also is real. And equally real are the different forms of God and the feeling that God is a person, with a capital P. Okay, so here are the 2 questions. I just presented to you the classical Advaitic interpretation of this sentence. Do you find that interpretation plausible? Why or why not? In the context, I know the context is probably hard to remember because we talked about it last time, but I hope you, in general, you have a sense of his teachings. And then secondly, if you don't like the classical Advaitic interpretation, what's a better interpretation? What's a more plausible interpretation of this statement? People are thinking hard. Anyone? No? She's laughing. All right. Well, I can make it serious. Yeah. Can you give the mic to her? Her favorite thing. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I would say, I don't remember much of the context, but if I just focus on the paragraph, I would say that it is plausible to interpret it in both ways, both as an Advaita, like classic Advaita interpretation, and then
What's
maybe the other one would be more like when he says, as long as you're like identifying with your like individuality, meaning like maybe you're still remaining in your physical body. Like as long as we remain like in the physical body, like then, everything else.
Well, I see you're taking individuality here to mean the physical body. Is that the idea?
That's how I would think about it in the other way. Like as long as I remain like in this sense of somewhat separateness or like...
Yeah, let me read the original Bengali of these sentences for those of you who know. Kintu jotokhon tumi nije shotto. Tumi just means you in Bengali. So long as you are real, actually. Individuality sounds very abstract, but he's just saying you. So long as you are real, totokhon jogoto shotto. So long is the world also real. Ishwarer nana rupo shotto. And the forms of God are also real. Ishwar ke bhakti bodho shotto. And the idea of God as personal is also shotto, is also true. Okay, so I'm trying to understand better your alternative interpretation of this sentence. Okay, Narayana wants to take a step.
No, you go, Narayana.
Well, another point of view is that from the point of view of the Bhakta, that the world would be like the sugar that you want to eat
rather than become.
Yeah, rather than become. Whereas the Advaita is basically becoming the sugar as opposed to wanting to just taste it. And apparently Ramakrishna says that people can remain in that state of the bhakta and just enjoy
eternally, right?
Eternally.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. So I think the second interpretation, maybe that's helping to clarify this alternative interpretation that Kiran is also suggesting. Okay, can you give the mic to Suman here? Okay.
I think the word as long as is actually making it lean towards Advaita.
Classical Advaita.
Classical Advaita.
Jotokun, totokun are the
Jotokun,
Bengali,
yeah.
which means as long as. But, well, explain. You can't just leave the mic. Don't drop the mic. Continue.
What he means is that as long as I have this individuated ego, until then this this world is real,
Absolutely. So long as,
so long as, and the personal God is real. In fact, that encompasses even the Vishishtadvaita interpretation of conclusions, right? In the sense that as long as you are the devotee, your Krishna is there. Krishna as a person is there.
Wait, but do you disagree with Narayana's suggestion that he's trying to link it with Sri Ramakrishna's other teachings, like the fact that there's an idea of an eternal form of God, Nitya Shakar, and the fact that becoming sugar and eating sugar are on a par?
That's exactly what I'm saying.
But that's not classical Advaita again. Do you see what I mean? At least on...
But as long as, right? But once you, let's say I want to taste sugar right now, and I am separate from God.
Yes.
But now, let's say I change my mind and I want to become sugar.
Sure.
Then there is no personal God anymore.
No.
Then it's like
but
impersonal.
Again, it still sounds to me like you're explaining the Vijnana Vedanta. Hold on, keep the mic. Just don't be in such a rush to get rid of it. Okay.
I'll get it.
It still seems to me as if what you just articulated is actually more in line with Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta than classical Advaita. Why? Because remember again, the entire classical Advaita Vedanta metaphysics is grounded in this two-tier ontology. The standpoint of ignorance and the standpoint of truth. Okay. Which means what? One is the ultimate truth and the other is just, it's an illusion. Yeah. But it doesn't seem like that's what you're saying.
Okay, yeah. I have a very hard time distinguishing between Advaita and Vigyana.
Okay.
So
Vigyana is Advaita, but it's a life affirming.
It's hard.
You have trouble. Okay,
yeah.
All right, it's hard for you.
Thank you.
Okay, sounds like it's turning into a Dr. Phil episode. It's hard for me. I'm joking. Okay. All right. Anyone else want to take a stab? Okay, Rama wants to take a stab.
Maybe this is taken from a position, it could be either before or after having gone to the non-dual pure consciousness state, such that either way, as long as they're identified with the personal body, it's still, that relationship can be developed, but it's not necessarily one or the other.
Yeah, no, I think that's kind of along the lines of what Narayana is saying too, is that, but you're saying, this is another way of thinking about it is, using the staircase metaphor. You're an individual while you're climbing the staircase. You lose your individuality when you reach the roof, which is the knowledge of non-dual Brahman in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. You become the salt all melting in the ocean. But then if you're a Vijnani, you can then go up and down the staircase again with an individuality, but this time it's Bhaktirami. You retain the eye of a devotee for the sake of enjoying the bliss and love of God in order to help others, right? Yeah, I think that's nice. So yeah, I mean, all three of you are kind of, and you actually, without knowing it. You're a closet Vijnana Vedantan who thinks he's a Shankarite. That's fine. So I think all of you are moving in the same direction here, which is that the Vijnana Vedanta interpretation of this sentence would be something like this. And this is also very much in line with Swami Tapasanandaji's overall interpretation of Sri Ramakrishna in his introduction to the Bhakti Schools of Vedanta. This book he wrote called Bhakti Schools of Vedanta, it's in the introduction. What he says is this. He says, look, in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, which is reaching the roof, okay, in Sri Ramakrishna's metaphor, there's no question of an individuality. There's no subject-object duality at all. That's why Sri Ramakrishna used the example of a salt doll melting into the ocean. There's just the ocean of infinite, non-dual, pure consciousness, okay? Now, in that state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, obviously no sense of individuality. There's no perception of the external world, so no question of names and forms, anything in the world. And also there's no perception of the personal God. There's no Shakti there. There's just non-dual pure consciousness, okay? But what Tapasanji adds is, in that state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, you don't perceive the personal God, names and forms, or the individual, or your own individuality. That doesn't mean that they don't exist. It's just like this. I'm looking at you now. I don't see Gopal in the corner. I know he's there. Yeah, he's always there. Good old Gopal. So, but I had to infer that. I don't see him. I don't perceive him when I look at Kiran. Do you see? Does it mean that Gopal doesn't exist? No. Tapasanaji is saying, in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, it's a special spiritual state in which you perceive one thing at the expense of other things. And that's just common sense, you know. I look in one direction or I look at one side of a house. I don't see the other side of a house. Does it mean that other side of the house doesn't exist? No. So that's the Vijnana Vedanta interpretation. And when I come out of the Nirvikalpa Samadhi state, what happens? I perceive the personal God. I have a sense of I again, and I see this world of names and forms. And that doesn't make the personal God and the world of names and forms and my individuality somehow less real than the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi when I've merged my individuality and non-dual pure consciousness. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's like switching off the mind and switching on the mind.
Okay, can you say, just for the benefit of the online audience? Yeah, say it again.
It's like Nirvikalpa Samadhi is switching off the mind, and then again switching on the mind. And
That's nice, yeah. It might even, yeah, that's a nice, I like that analogy because with the light, right? So imagine we're all in this room and the light is suddenly turned off. We can't perceive each other. Does it mean we don't exist? No. And you turn on the light again, voila, we're here again. So that's nice, yeah. Huh?
Just like
The eclipse. The sun doesn't disappear. We don't perceive it. That's also good analogies. Good. This is good. I like this. This is very participatory. It's exactly what I'm looking for. Crowdsourcing. You guys are cutting edge. Thank you. Okay. So, excellent. You're all Vijnana Vedantins, even if you don't know it. Okay. Okay, now I want to say a little bit more about this sentence. Okay, there's a lot to unpack in just this one sentence. I think in this sentence is also a warning to followers of Shankara's classical Advaita. The warning is, it's all very intellectually cool and glamorous to believe that only non-dual pure conscious alone exists and everything else is unreal, it's a dream. But it's extremely dangerous to try to put that into practice so long as you have any sense of I whatsoever. As long as there's even a trace of ego. As long as there's even a trace of worldliness in you. He says it in many places in the gospel. Many, many places. I think the most direct and kind of scathing version of this statement is when he says, if you try to practice the path of knowledge while still having body consciousness, you end up deceiving yourself and you end up deceiving others. So I think that's also built into this. So just a kind of intellectual practice of the path of knowledge for people who still have worldly attachments and pleasures and body consciousness, this is a recipe for spiritual ruin. This is what I take Sri Ramakrishna to be saying also. It's also implied in this sentence. Okay? Okay. So thank you. Now, let's keep going. I want to get, actually, the focus of the class, even though I gave the title of the class today as Soul Realization, now I'm going to change the title afterward, and I'm going to call it The 7 Planes of Consciousness, the Saptabhumi, because I want to focus on the whole 7 planes if possible. But before we get there, we have a couple paragraphs. Sri Ramakrishna continues, yours is the path of bhakti. Remember, who's his audience? Brahma Samaj. These are followers of Brahma Samaj. And they are bhaktas because they worship God as Nirakara Saguna, formless personal God, right? Okay. Yours is the path of bhakti. That is very good. It is an easy path. Who can fully know the infinite God? And what need is there of knowing the infinite? Having attained this rare human birth, my supreme need is to develop love for the lotus feet of God. If a jug of water is enough to remove my thirst, why should I measure the quantity of water in a lake? I become drunk on even half a bottle of wine. What is the use of my calculating the quantity of liquor in the tavern? What need is there of knowing the infinite? Now again, I think we need to look at the Bengali a little bit here. Because he says, watch, I just want to focus on a few sentences here. He says, who can fully know the infinite God? This is Nikalanji's translation. The Bengali here is, অনন্ত ঈশ্বরকে কি জানা যায়? অনন্ত ঈশ্বর কি জানা যায়? ঈশ্বরকে কি জানা যায়? Ananta Ishvara, can you know the Ananta Ishvara? And Nikalanji adds fully here. the adverb fully, which is not in the Bengali, I think it's a good addition. The reason being that if he just said, who can know the infinite God, which is actually literally what the Bengali says, how might we interpret that sentence? God realization is impossible. Knowledge of God is impossible. That's not what Sri Ramakrishna means. Ananta Ishwarke ki jana jai doesn't mean how can we possibly know the infinite God. He means how can we ever know the whole of the infinite God? So then it becomes aligned with the ant parable, which I love to tell. An ant goes to a giant hill of sugar. With great difficulty, takes 1 or 2 grains of that sugar, then gets puffed up with pride and says, next time I go to the hill, I'll take the whole hill with me. Which is foolish, because we can never know the entirety or the infinitude of the infinite God, but we can certainly attain realization of forms and aspects of the infinite divine. Okay, and so that's why I like Nikhilanji's addition of fully here. Who can fully know the infinite God? Just to clarify, of course we can know God, just not in his or her or its infinitude. Okay. And what need is there of knowing the infinite? And again, this is not to mean, oh, who cares about God realization? That's clearly not what he's saying. The goal of life is to know God. But knowing God in any form or aspect is good enough. It's enough to get you drunk. That's the analogy that he himself uses in the next paragraph, right? You don't need to drink every liquor bottle in the entire liquor store. You drink one, you're drunk. Probably not even a whole one. Okay? So that's the idea. And the Vigyani, then you might ask, well, doesn't the Vigyani know the infinite God? What's the answer? She's shaking her head vigorously. Why? Yeah, very good. What, can you say it to the mic so that the online people can hear?
Maybe just a couple bottles.
Yeah, right. Good, very good. So maybe, like, we can think of an ordinary jivakoti. We can think of as somebody who goes in that liquor store, takes 2, or let's say 1 Budweiser, is a lightweight, and gets drunk from that. Okay. And another person goes in there, Budweiser and a Heineken and like some whiskey or whatever. That's more like the Vigyani. Don't yell at me because it's Sri Ramakrishna's metaphor. He's using the analogy, I'm just adding some details. Okay. So let's say 3 bottles or something for the Vigyani. But there are 3,000 in the store. Nobody can drink all 3,000 and still live. They'll die before they reach, okay? And so only the infinite God can know the infinite God, right? So you have to become God to know the infinitude of God. Okay. Yes.
Where he says, yours is the path of bhakti, that just surprises me because I guess in my limited understanding, I always thought a bhakti had to have a form, not just a formless personal. I don't even understand formless and personal at the same time.
Yeah,
but that just
I think you missed the
me.
crucial class we had on this. I think 2 classes ago, or was it last class? Kind of both. Yeah. Okay. So here's the thing: traditions like Islam, Sikhism, Judaism, and Brahma Samaj all are devotional traditions. They all believe in bhakti as the main practice. And they believe in a personal God, even though they don't accept God with forms. Not just that they don't accept incarnations, they don't even believe in the possibility of like Kali with 4 arms, or Durga, or Ganesha, or anything. No forms of God. Okay. And the idea here is, what does it mean for God to be personal? Saguna. It means having the omni attributes, being omniscient, omnipotent, perfectly loving. None of those things require a form. You see what I mean? And so if you look at any of the Brahma Samaj music, there's beautiful songs, Tagore's songs, almost all of them, they don't talk about God with form, but they're full of ecstatic bhakti, devotion and longing for God, the personal God. Okay, that's the idea. Yeah. Get it, Mike.
I'm just curious. Do you think if someone merges into the ocean, like Saldal merging into the ocean, like, do you think that would be like knowing the infinite because you become the infinite?
Yeah, I think you can only know the infinite by becoming the infinite. Brahmavit Brahmaiva Bhavati. Brahmavit Brahmaiva Bhavati is from Taittiriya Upanishad. The Brahmavit, the knower Brahman, Brahma Eva Bhavati, literally becomes Brahman. So that's right, yeah. So you can only know the infinite by becoming the infinite. And now, the interesting thing about the Vigyani actually is that it gets a little complicated with regard to what we were just talking about, because part of the realization of a Vigyani is that there's nothing but God. And that God, that the divine is playfully manifesting as each of us. If that's true, and if that's part of the Vigyani's realization, then the Vigyani, at least in a certain state of consciousness, should be one with the divine consciousness, which is exactly the kind of identity with the divine, with the infinite divine that I think you're talking about. Notice that in the gospel, he's in two different states of consciousness, at least. One of them, usually, it's child praying to Divine Mother. And when people will say things like, there's some place in the gospel when somebody says, you yourself are God. He says, oh, no, don't say that. I'm just the dust of the, well, and like very humble and saying, I'm just a child of mother and this and that. But there's another place in the same gospel where he looks around, checks to see that they're only his own antaranga, his own inner circle. And he says, I saw Satchitananda coming out of my own body. And it told me that Purna Abhirbhav, that Satchitananda has fully manifested in me, in this body. He wouldn't say me, in this body. Kintu shotte roishojjo, he would say. But with the Aishwarya, with the glory of Sattva Guna. And so it's hidden. That divinity of his is hidden to most people. You have to be very subtle and sattvic to recognize his own divinity. So in Chaitanya would go through these two different states as well. Sometimes mostly identifying as a bhakta of Krishna, but then sometimes identifying with Krishna himself. And so I think the Vigyani, it would be a mistake to limit the Vigyani to just the bhakta, the eye of a bhakta, or the eye of God. It's really both, and that's part of the point of the Vigyani's being able to go up and down the staircase. The idea is you can identify with divine consciousness itself, identify with God, and you can also identify with the eye of a bhakta and adopt that. Yeah? Thank you. Good question. Okay, we're going to tackle the Sapta Bhumi, the 7 planes of consciousness now for the remainder of the class, probably. Because it's, you see what's going on back here. Okay. I might take 2 classes, I don't know. Okay. The various states of mind of the Brahmagyani are described in the Vedas. Okay, hold on, sorry. This is a new chapter. Let me first tell you that. This is a new chapter in M's Kautamrita. It's chapter 6, Shoshta Parichid. And he has an epigraph from the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 3, verse 17. Yastvatmaratireva syat Matriptascha manavaha atmanyeva cha santushtas tasya karyam na vidyate. That person whose sole delight is in the Atman and who is ever satisfied in his or her own Atman. Atmanyeva, okay, that person, karyam na vidyate, tasya karyam na vidyate. That person has nothing to do. Literally, karyam, you have nothing to do. He's bored. No. This is interesting because Shankara he has a field day with this verse and kindred verses in the Gita. And Shankara will say, see, the person who has realized the self, this very spiritually evolved soul, renounces all actions, can't act. Okay? Sri Aurobindo, in his essays on the Gita, he interprets this verse differently. Tasya karyam na vidyate, and he's emphasizing the word karyam, which means literally, it's a duty, something you have to do, out of duty or something that you must do, out of necessity. He's saying, for the realized soul, there are no duties. And there's no sense of doership anymore. But that doesn't mean you have to renounce actions. You could, but it doesn't entail the renunciation. Without a sense of doership, as an instrument of the divine, and not out of a sense of duty, but in order to help others out of their spiritual ignorance. That's the idea, okay? Okay, that was a tangent because I'm just explaining M's epigraph, which is missing from Nikhilanji's translation. And then M's section heading for the first section of chapter 6 is the following. Ishwarlabhed Lokkon, Shaptobhumi o Brahmogyan. Okay, Ishwarlabhed Lokkon means the characteristics of or the features of God realization. When you realize God, what does that look like? And Shaptabhumi or Brahma again. Saptabhumi, the 7 planes of consciousness, and Brahmagyana, the knowledge of Brahman. Heavy stuff, okay? So here we go. Okay. The various states of mind of the Brahmagyani are described in the Vedas. The path of knowledge is extremely difficult. This is Shankara's, that classical Advaita. One cannot obtain jnana if one has the least trace of worldliness and the slightest attachment to kamini kanchan. This is not the path for the Kali Yuga. Okay. I wanted to pause here just before going into the Saptabhumi here. The path of knowledge is extremely difficult. Why is it that the path of knowledge is so difficult? If you have even the slightest trace of worldliness or the slightest attachment to kamini kanchan, you cannot attain jnana. And so then the question might be, well, Sri Ramakrishna keeps saying the path of bhakti is much easier. Does it mean that we can realize God with worldliness and with attachments if we're bhaktas? So what does he mean here? Let me read it to you again. The path of knowledge is extremely difficult. One cannot obtain jnana, knowledge of Brahman, if one has the least trace of worldliness and the slightest attachment to kamini kanchan. This is not the path for the Kali Yuga. And instead the path is, as he says, yours is the path of bhakti. But is he implying or stating that if we practice the path of bhakti, it's like kind of like you can have your cake and eat it too. I can have all my worldly pleasures and attachments and still realize God. Is that what he's saying? Obviously not. So then how should we interpret this?
It's a lot easier to get rid of worldliness and attachment to sense pleasures and everything with the path of bhakti.
Yes, right. It's easier, and why?
Well, your natural tendencies are used to get rid of your natural tendencies.
Okay, good, yeah. Like Sri Ramakrishna would say, morphidya though. You have lust and anger and greed, give them a Godward turn. Yeah, can you give it to Geeta?
I mean, that was good.
Huh? Okay. She got all nervous. Okay. Look, yes, I think that's right. And I think there's an even more emphatic way to put this. The path of knowledge has fundamental and very stringent prerequisites in order to get off the ground with it. What are those? Very precise. Shankara just gives a list in his commentary on Brahma Sutra 1.1.1. It's called sadhana chatushtaya, the fourfold sadhana. You have to be perfectly equipped with viveka, discrimination between what's real and unreal, what's permanent and impermanent. Second, vairagya, intense detachment, perfect detachment toward everything in the world. Shat Sampat, the 6 treasures of spiritual life, perfect sense control, perfect mind control, perfect control of the mind, control of your thoughts, and a bunch of other very high spiritual qualities. And then finally, the 4th, mumukshutva, intense aspiration for liberation. And unless you are equipped with all 4 of these to the full, you are not qualified to even read the texts of Advaita Vedanta. You shouldn't be reading Shankara's commentaries, let alone practicing the path of knowledge. Whereas, but let me just finish this and then we'll get to the path of bhakti has no prerequisites. What a wonderful thing. It's not like I need to have a bachelor's and a master's degree to do the PhD. No, nothing. That's more like the path of knowledge is like that. It's like the PhD. Doing a PhD requires having gone through K through 12 first, and then the bachelor's, and then the master's. Bhakti says, you're a 5-year-old, never gone to school? No problem. No school, no problem. I will educate you. I will make you greater than all the PhDs in the world. Not me, I mean, God, through the path of bhakti. Narayana.
Every time I hear those qualifications for being a jnani, it sounds like if you have those qualifications, you're already there. It doesn't sound like, they sound so stringent that it doesn't sound like there's any way of getting into that.
I've thought about that myself when I studied Shankara's commentaries, and because it seems so high level, and I think it is high level, and that's why they even have this idea of 2 different kinds of sannyasa. One is vidvat sannyasa, and the other is vividisha sannyasa. Vividisha sannyasa is like ordinary people like us who are given sannyasa after a certain amount of time if you can hang for 9 or 10 years in the monastic order, and you don't do something too terrible, you get your sannyasa. But vidvat sannyasa means you get sannyasa after attaining knowledge of Brahman. Vidvat. The moment you gain knowledge of Brahman, take sannyasa, because what else is there to do in life once you realize Brahman? Okay, so it is very high level, I think, is the beginning of the answer. And then I would add this, because Shankara says this in certain places in the Sanskrit commentaries. He says things like, you need to have almost entirely attenuated your body consciousness and realize yourself at least as the Jivatman separate from the body-mind complex in order to be qualified to practice the path of knowledge. So that's very high level already. We're going to find that in a second. That's the fourth plane that he talks about, the heart center, when you realize yourself as a Jivatman. That's nothing to sneeze at. It's a very high level realization. And it's only when you get to that plane, when you realize that you're actually an eternal soul separate from the body-mind complex, and then each of you, I look at you not as bodies or as minds, but as souls. Then obviously I'm not going to be attracted to the body anymore. I won't be attracted to the things of the world because I just see spirit everywhere, right? So I think you're right. That's the intuition is right, actually. It is very high level, but it's just short of Brahma Jnana. Because remember, realizing the Jivatman is not the same as realization of non-dual pure consciousness. Okay? Yeah, thanks. Okay, so now we're going to plunge into, so I explained. So bhakti, we don't, in the path of bhakti, there are no prerequisites. Okay, so just think about simple examples. Girish Ghosh, alcoholic, complaining to Sri Ramakrishna about his alcoholism. Sri Ramakrishna says, okay, here's what you do. He's not telling him to renounce because he knows that's too hard for him at that point. He says, okay, next time you feel like drinking, offer it to Divine Mother first. It's exactly what you were saying about you have these worldly desires, attachments, cravings. This is exactly one concrete way that Sri Ramakrishna will encourage us as, in the path of bhakti. You can harness that energy, but turn it towards God, right? Okay. And the other thing, whatever your difficulties are, whatever your problems are, whatever you're struggling with, on the path of bhakti, it's so wonderful. Just complain to God about it. And then that complaint itself is a form of prayer, and that itself purifies the mind if you're sincere about it. That's why Sri Ramakrishna will say, pray with tears in your eyes. If you pray with tears in your kine pratana, and you say, oh Lord, I'm overwhelmed now with grief or lust or anger or this or that. If you are really sincere, within moments it's gonna diminish. That feeling is gonna diminish. That's the beauty of the path of bhakti. Okay. Now we do need to get to Saptabhumi here, so we're gonna do that now. All right. We may have to continue in the next class. We'll see. Okay. Here we go. The Vedas speak of 7 planes where the mind dwells. Okay. The term here is E shambonde bede shopto bhumir kotha ache, and M, sometimes rarely, but he sometimes adds English phrases to explain the Bengali term, and here is one of those cases. He's shopto bhumi, after the word sapta bhumi is used. He himself, M, writes 7 planes. Okay? So, E shambonde bede shopto bhumir, 7 planes kotha ache. Okay. Sri Ramakrishna says, when the mind is immersed in worldliness, the Bengali here is shangshar, samsara. It dwells in the 3 lower planes, at the navel, the organ of generation, and the organ of evacuation. Okay? Tokon lingo gujjo nabi moner bastan. Okay. In that state, the mind loses all of its higher visions, urdhva drishti, looking up literally. You lose all that. You look downward at lust and greed. It broods only on kamini and kanchan. Then, the 4th plane of the mind is at the heart. When the mind dwells there, one has the first glimpse of spiritual consciousness. The word here is significant. Chaitanya, spiritual consciousness, or divine consciousness. One sees light all around, L-I-G-H-T. Such a man, perceiving the divine light, becomes speechless with wonder and says, what is this? What is this? That person's mind does not go downward to the objects of the world. The 5th plane of the mind is at the throat. When the mind reaches this, the aspirant becomes free from all ignorance and illusion. He does not enjoy talking or hearing about anything but God. If people talk about worldly things, he leaves the place at once. The sixth plane is at the forehead, between the eyebrows. When the mind reaches it, the Bengali here is kopal. It literally means forehead, but I think he really has in mind here. When the mind reaches it, the aspirant sees the form of God day and night. But even then, a little trace of ego remains. At the sight of that incomparable beauty of God's form, one becomes intoxicated and rushes forth to touch and embrace it, but one does not succeed. It is like the light inside a lantern. One feels as if one could touch the light, but one cannot on account of the pane of glass. So there's like a slight separation between the personal God and you. You want to reach out, but you can't. You're hitting that pane of glass. In the top of the head is the seventh plane. When the mind rises there, one goes into samadhi. This must be nirvikalpa samadhi. Then the Brahmagyani directly perceives Brahman. But in that state, his body does not last many days. He remains unconscious of the outer world. If milk is poured into his mouth, it runs out. Dwelling on this plane of consciousness, he gives up his body in 21 days. That is the condition of the Brahmagyani. But yours is the path of devotion. That is a very good and easy path. Okay, let's pause here. Lots to talk about. The very first sentence. The Vedas speak of 7 planes where the mind dwells. Vede shaptu bhumit kothache. He just says Veda here. Now, first question. Where in the Vedas are these 7 planes talked about? Not such an easy question to answer, as far as I can tell. I've asked a number of people. I've attempted to find scriptural references myself without success. I asked a few Swamis. One Swami looked at a book by Pragyananandaji, who was a disciple of Medhananda, a very scholarly monk, and he has a book called Banyo Rachana, I think. Not Banyo Rachana. Anyway, there's a big multi-volume work of his interpreting Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. They're in Bengali. And he mentions this teaching of Sri Ramakrishna's, Veda Shaptabhumi Kotache. You find this teachings of the Saptabhumi in the Vedas. But he also doesn't take, as far as I could tell, he doesn't suggest where in the Vedas you can find this teaching. And so in despair, what did I do? I turned to ChatGPT. And it gave me a suggestion, which was remarkably helpful, actually. And so let me read to you what it says. It says, Sri Ramakrishna's statement, the Vedas speak of 7 planes where the mind dwells, does not directly quote a specific verse from the Vedas, but rather draws upon a rich synthesis of Vedic and Upanishadic cosmology as interpreted through the lens of mystical experience and the Tantric Vedantic worldview. His reference likely reflects an esoteric or yogic interpretation of Vedic and Upanishadic themes, especially as received and elaborated in later traditions like Yoga, Vedanta, Tantra, and the Puranas. Here's a breakdown of possible Vedic and Upanishadic roots for the idea of the 7 planes, and it gives a number, and I like the first one the best, and that's what I'm developing here. Number 1, the concept of the 7 lokas, worlds. The Vedas, especially the Rig Veda and Taittiriya Upanishad, and later literature frequently mention 7 lokas, planes or worlds, sapta loka, okay? Bhuhu, earth. Bhuvaha, atmosphere. Swaha, heaven. Maha, great world. Janaha, world of the saints. Tapaha, world of austerity. Satyam, world of truth. Okay. Now, then, ChatGPT goes on to say, these are famously recited in the Gayatri Mantra's extension, Om Bhur Bhuva Swaha, right? So we know that. That's the first 3. Then it says, these are cosmic planes, meaning they're actual cosmic state, like worlds, right? Realms beyond the earth, and the earth itself is Bhu. These are cosmic planes, but in yogic and mystical traditions, they are interpreted as states or planes of consciousness. And this is very interesting. I never thought about that before. And then I started thinking, wow, that's really interesting. So possibly what Sri Ramakrishna is thinking of are the Sapta Lokas in the Vedas, which are all over the Vedas. There's no doubt that the Vedas talk about the Sapta Lokas, which are actual cosmic worlds, okay? But then there's a kind of esoteric mystical correspondence between each of these lokas in the Vedas with certain states of consciousness, planes of consciousness. And then I thought, well, if anybody in the world has developed this correspondence, it's got to be Sri Aurobindo. Because he wrote an entire book called The Secret of the Veda. And he was strongly influenced by Sri Ramakrishna. And as I was doing research on this, I realized that I got to add something to my chapter on the first chapter of my Aurobindo book, because I'm trying to show the different ways that Sri Ramakrishna had influenced Sri Aurobindo. And I think this statement of Sri Ramakrishna's, that you can find this idea of the 7 planes of consciousness in the Vedas, you tell me whether is this a coincidence or is this an influence. So I'm going to be quoting from Sri Aurobindo's Essays on the Gita. He says, in the Veda also we have 3 supreme worlds whose names are not given. Don't worry about that. But then he says, but in the Vedantic and Puranic system, the 7 worlds, so he's talking about the 7 worlds of the Vedas, correspond to 7 psychological principles or forms of existence. Sat, Chit, Ananda, Vigyana, Manas, Prana, and Anna, in reverse order. Okay? And then he says, I'll finish reading, then I'll explain. These are all these, I'm sure it's gobbledygook to some people. Now, Vigyana, the central principle, which he calls supermind. Now, Vigyana, the central principle, the principle of Mahas, fourth in the Saptalokas, is followed in the ascending order by Jana, the world of Ananda. See the correspondences? Of the divine bliss. In the Veda also Ritam, the truth, leads upward to Mayas, bliss. We may therefore be fairly sure that the 2 systems are identical and that both depend on the same idea of 7 principles of subjective consciousness, formulating themselves in 7 objective worlds. On this principle, I was able to identify the Vedic worlds, the Saptaloka, with the corresponding psychological planes of consciousness, and the whole Vedic system became clear to my mind. So this is quite striking, it seems to me. Now, what in the world do these terms mean, and where is he getting this from? See, Saptaloka is from the Vedas. Those are the actual worlds. Bhuhu being this world we're sitting in now in this class, and then other higher worlds. Okay, now here, he's drawing these first 5 terms from Taittiriya Upanishad. Taittiriya Upanishad distinguishes 5 kinds of self, 5 kinds of Atman or Purusha. Kosha is actually not a term used in the Taittiriya Upanishad. Yeah, right, exactly. Right. So most people think that there are 5 koshas, but sheets, but in fact they're not. There are 5 Atmas or Purushas. What are they? Annamaya, the self of matter. Then Pranamaya, the self of prana, the vital force, life. Manomaya, the self of mind. Vigyana, extremely crucial, because it's a kind of mediating principle between the 3 principles of lower existence, like body, life, mind, which is what we're all identified with just body, life, mind. We haven't realized God. Vigyana is a mediating principle. He calls it supermind. And that's Vijnanamaya Atma in the Taittiriya Upanishad, the 4th Atma. 5th Atma is Anandamaya Atma. It's the bliss self. And look at Sri Aurobindo's brilliance here in terms of classifications. Look at this in reverse order. Sat Chit Ananda. That is existence, consciousness, bliss, right? And Vijnana is the mediating state of consciousness between the divine Sat Chit Ananda on the one hand and body, life, mind on the other. Okay. Now, can we begin to explore this? So, does it work? I mean, can we do these kinds of correspondences? I think that there's some initial plausibility to doing these mappings because, look, like the organ, what does Sri Ramakrishna say about this, the first 3? So long as consciousness is centered in these 3 lower planes, and it's, right, organ of evacuation, generation, and navel, we're thinking only of worldly things. We have worldly attachments, pleasures. We can't think of anything spiritual, of God. And they're the 3 lowest planes. And from a mystical standpoint, and from an esoteric psychological standpoint, they correspond to body, life, and mind. which we ignorantly identify with. Not that they're unreal, but it's certainly not our deepest spiritual essence, right?
So you're comparing them.
Can you give the mic to her? Well, I see them as correspondences.
Yeah, so you're saying that heaven is the lower level? Navel?
Yeah, but again, remember,
Uh-huh.
these are, it's certain, see, navel is higher than the other two, right?
Yeah.
But it's still not the highest. And the thing is, in the Vedantic scriptures, there are two different kinds of heaven. One is the temporary svarga, where you go to exhaust your good karma, you have a nice time, but then you have to come back. And then there are eternal heavens for liberated bhaktas, like a Ramakrishna loka, Goloka for the Vaishnavas, Christian heaven, Jannah in Islamic, there's an Islamic paradise. Right, so this is probably more like the temporary heaven. It's a kind of lower scale
Okay.
heaven. Otherwise, why would there be four more, even
Okay.
nicer heavens after that, right?
So where would you say, like we say when we say Indra, Varuna, and all those? Are
Indra and Varuna.
Varuna, are they in this heaven or the higher heaven?
Look, the thing about Indra and Varuna, these are Vedic godheads, right?
Yeah.
And then Sri Aurobindo has elaborate interpretations of Indra and Varuna and all that.
Yeah.
But depending on how you interpret these terms, so one Vedantic way of understanding it, Swami Vivekananda often interprets it this way, is that Indra is a kind of post. It's like being a chief executive officer in a company or something. Like once, whoever, Sundar Pichai goes away as the CEO of Google, somebody else will fill the role. So like that, some soul is Indra, but 1,000 years from now it might be somebody else, right? Whose karma makes that person fit to be Indra. So that's a kind of lower level understanding of Indra and Varuna. Then Sri Aurobindo gives a kind of higher interpretation. If we think of the Rigvedic, that famous mantra that Swami Vivekananda liked to quote, Ekam sad vipra bahuda vadanti. So there's one truth, there's one reality, one divine, called by various names like Indra and Varuna. In that sense, Indra and Varuna, they're just different names and forms of the same infinite divine.
But in the Vedas, like in the Purusha Shuktam, doesn't they say that like the Indra, they praise Indra? Or is it in Purusha Shuktam or which Shuktam that they praise Indra? Or like they also say like the Indra is the god of eyes or some organs, right? So
Yeah.
is it the same Indra we are talking about, or it just...
It depends on the interpretation. That's the thing, is that you can interpret it in different ways. You can interpret the same Indra in a lower way as just a minor deity, or you can interpret him as one form of the infinite divine.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Now, so I'm beginning to sort of make a case for these correspondences. Why am I doing all this? Well, because Sri Ramakrishna says in the Vedas you find the Saptabhumi, and there's no immediate answer to the question of, well, where in the Vedas? Yeah.
I have an idea. The Swami Vivekananda says the Vedas are like an eternal truth that's not necessarily only in the written Vedas. He says that the Vedas precede the books of the Vedas and the...
They're eternal laws. They're spiritual laws.
Right. So it could be in that. Maybe he's referring to in the Vedas before. Maybe there's no written one.
I asked two Swamis a little earlier. I'm not naming names. And they both kind of suggested an answer along the lines, which is that, look, like a lot of the Vedas are missing now. The texts are lost. But there's a long-standing oral tradition. And so certain teachings from the Vedas and mantras have been passed down orally, but you won't be able to find the corresponding written text. That could be true. That's not exactly your point.
I just mean that maybe none of the oral traditions actually have the complete Vedas in it, because the Vedas are eternal before even the creation, according to Swami Vivekananda. Remember that?
Okay. Right. Okay. So you're suggesting if we interpret Vedas here in Sri Ramakrishna's sentence, in the Vedas you find the Saptabhumi, not in the sense of the actual four Vedas, but in the sense of eternal spiritual laws. then we can find the Saptabhumi and everything else, right? So that's true. I mean, that's possible. And but I still think it's worth exploring, because Sri Ramakrishna often refers to actual scriptures. He says, in the Gita you find this, in the Bhagavata Purana you find this, in the Adhyatma Ramayana you find this, in the Chandi you find this, right? And so along those lines, he says, Veda, in the Vedas. I think the more plausible interpretation of Veda here would be the books that he has in mind, the Rig Veda, the Yajur Veda. And if we take it to mean the actual scriptures, which are now, we find them in written form, even though they're originally orally transmitted, then we still have this big question. Well, where do we find the Saptabhumi in the Vedas? And the best stab that I can take at this is that and thanks to the help of ChatGPT, that you find the Saptaloka in the Vedas, which are actual cosmic worlds, they're different worlds, starting with this earth. But that Sri Aurobindo has this very elaborate mystical kind of correspondence of each of these lokas with these different states of consciousness. And Vigyana is very interesting here. Why? Because this is one of Sri Ramakrishna's favorite terms, and Sri Ramakrishna again and again would teach that there are these different states of spiritual experience, jnana followed by Vigyana. And he specifically says the Vigyana is the one who, after reaching the roof, looks down at the staircase and says, wait, they're made of the same brick, slime, and brick dust as the roof is. And then he can go up and down to his heart's content, and realizes that the divine is not only impersonal but also personal, and has many forms, and has become the 24 cosmic principles. And so can actually see the divine at the level of matter, life, and mind as well. And so, in an interesting kind of historical situation, Sri Aurobindo, who is strongly influenced by Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on Vigyana, also possibly was influenced by this specific teaching of Sri Ramakrishna's, that in the Vedas you find the Saptabhumi, the 7 planes of consciousness, to reinterpret the Saptalokas, the 7 worlds in the Vedas, in terms of the 7 psychological planes of consciousness, and taking its cue from the Taittiriya Upanishad and the 5 selves, with Vigyana as the mediating principle between Satchitananda and body, life, mind. Okay, this is all heavy stuff, but I want you to think about it. Okay, so we have a few more minutes. Okay, I wanted to just talk about the 4th plane, the heart plane, and then we can wrap it up. We'll continue next time. See, the heart plane. In this particular passage, he says, one sees light all around. Such a person, perceiving the divine light, becomes speechless with wonder and says, what is this? What is this? Okay, his mind does not go downward to the objects of the world in the heart center, right? Now, I think it's helpful to add to this another version of the same description. This is from his entry from June 10th, 1883, so a few months later. He's explaining the realization at the heart center. He says, when the mind ascends to the 4th plane, the center designated in yoga as anahata. So now he's bringing in a different paradigm. Let's not get too confused here. So anyway, it's the same idea, but it's the heart center. It sees the individual soul, the jiva, as a flame. Besides, it sees light. At this, the aspirant cries, what is this? What is this? So the crucial bit of information which is added here, which you don't find here, is that it's the realization of the jivatman, the individual soul, separate from the body-mind complex. Okay? That's very, very important. And it's nothing to sneeze at. We shouldn't sneeze at this. We shouldn't think the jiva there's still subject-object duality. It's still individuality. You have no idea what an extraordinary realization this is. Because for millions and millions of lifetimes, we've been identifying with this body-mind. Not necessarily this one, but many different kinds of bodies and minds. We have not once, and so when we realize ourselves as an eternal soul separate from the body-mind complex, it's a wondrous realization. So wondrous that this is just, I'm just throwing this out there, and you can have a different interpretation if you want. This is found in the authoritative biography of Sri Ramakrishna written by Swami Sharadanandaji, Lila Prasanga. It's an incident between Sri Ramakrishna and Hriday. So I wanted to read it to you. Shortly after this conversation between the master and Muthur, one night Hriday saw the master going towards the Panchavati. Thinking that he might require his water pot and towel, You know what? It's 8:34. I feel like we should. I don't want to rush this. So let me keep you in suspense, and then actually also let me find what the next class is. Not for a while. Okay, I'm going to give you a heads up on our next classes. Well, okay, I'm going to summarize what I had in mind, and then I'll explain it in more detail next time. Basically, there's an incident where Hriday keeps pestering him to give him a vision. And then Sri Ramakrishna gives him this vision, and Hriday gets so overwhelmed with ecstasy, spiritual ecstasy, and he starts seeing light everywhere, and himself as light, and he starts running around. And he tells Sri Ramakrishna, what does he say? He forgot himself. Thinking thus, he looked at his own body and saw that he too was an effulgent being made of light, an attendant and companion of God himself, serving him eternally, a part, so to say, of his person, which was light embodied, and now having a separate existence for the sole purpose of serving him. He was now in ecstasy, with only partial normal consciousness, and cried aloud repeatedly like one mad, O Ramakrishna, we are not mortal beings. Why are we here? Come, let us go from country to country and set souls free from bondage. I am also what you are. The master said to us, hearing him crying out thus, I said, stop. What's the matter with us that you are doing all this? People will run up here thinking some evil has befallen us. But did he give ear to it at all? I then came hardly to him, touched his heart, and said, make the fellow dull and drab again, O mother. So one way of interpreting this whole incident, when I only skimmed through it, I'll mention it again next time, is that because Hriday was pestering him so much, he gave him this realization of the Jivatman. And because Hriday was spiritually immature, he mistook that to mean like, I'm an avatara and let's hang out together and save the world. And because it's that amazing. It's nothing to poo-poo. It's a massive realization. Okay, so, all right. So this is important because in our order too, because a lot of us, I'm an exception, and there are a few others, but most of us, we teach Shankara's, most of the monks teach Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, and so any realization Jivatman is still duality, it's lower, that's the realm of bhakti and all that, and so we look down on it. There's one very senior monk who's a vice president named Bhajananandaji, and he would always say this, he still says this, he says, look, far more practical and helpful to us as spiritual aspirants, he's telling monks, then Shankara's Advaita Vedanta is Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita Vedanta. For this reason, of course, he means, we're all followers of Ramakrishna, but if you want to look at the traditional schools, why is Ramanuja more practical? Because Ramanuja says, before you are eligible to practice like high-level bhakti, which is constantly thinking of God, you have to realize yourself as a Jivatman, separate from the body-mind complex. He says, this is absolutely essential in spiritual life. And for any sannyasi, the first priority needs to be, for any spiritual aspirant, the first priority is, I need to realize myself as an eternal soul separate from the body-mind complex. And then that becomes the basis for God realization, self-realization, anything you want. But first get to this realization of the Jivatman. That happens at the heart center. Okay, so heads up on the next classes. July. I think we have 2 classes in July. One of them the next one is Tuesday, July 8th at 7:30 p.m. Tuesday, no, not Wednesday, but Tuesday, July 8th. And then Wednesday, July 30th at the very end of next month, the day before I go to South Africa. Okay, so yes, Wednesday, July 30th. Okay, so those are the next 2 classes. Stay tuned. And if you have thoughts, any of you online here, about the Saptabhumi, what Sri Ramakrishna might have had in mind when he said, you find the Saptabhumi, the 7 planes of consciousness in the Vedas. What do you think he means by that? Do you agree or disagree with this elaborate map of correspondences? Let me know. Thank you. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.
Is this the name of the book?